good evening, and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight, we begin the first part of a long and lonely journey, a story that stretches across a dying land and into the very heart of creation itself. We will follow the footsteps of Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger from a world that has moved on, as he pursues an enigmatic sorcerer on a quest that will define his soul. This is a story of obsession, of loss, and of the single, unyielding search for a mythical place that holds all the answers, the Dark Tower. If you enjoy these long tales and wish to support the channel, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment below. It helps the channel grow and ensures more stories can be told. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Roland's quest is an obsession that consumes his entire life. What is one thing, a goal or a dream, that you would pursue to the very ends of the earth? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Now, find a comfortable position. Let the world outside fade away. Let the story begin. Part 1. The Last Gunslinger and the Ghost of Tull. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was vast, a great expanse of white that seemed to go on forever. It was a place of bones and heat and silence. The sun was not a friendly yellow eye in the sky. It was a merciless, hateful ball of fire that beat down upon the land, bleaching everything it touched. The sand was not soft and golden. It was hard-packed alkali, cracked and broken like old pottery. It crunched under the gunslinger's boots with a sound like grinding teeth. For a time that had lost all meaning, the gunslinger walked. His name was Roland. He was the last of his kind. The world he had known was gone, washed away by time and tragedy. All that remained was the quest for the Dark Tower. And the first step on that long, long road was the man in black. Roland's steps were measured, economical. He did not waste energy. He had learned long ago that the desert punished wastefulness with death. He carried a small amount of dried meat in a pouch and 2 water skins on his belt. The water skins were old and cracked, but they did their job. They were nearly empty now. He would need to find water soon. He did not think about this with panic. Panic was another luxury the desert did not allow. He simply accepted it as a fact, another problem to be solved in a long line of problems. His mind was a quiet place, honed by years of focus into a single, sharp point. The point was aimed at the man in black. He walked from sunup to sundown. At night, the desert became a different kind of monster. The heat fled from the land, leaving a deep, biting cold in its place. The sky was not black, but a deep, impossible indigo, and it was filled with so many stars they looked like spilled salt. The constellations were all wrong. They were not the stars of his childhood. This was a different time, a different place. The world had moved on. He would build a small fire, not for warmth, for the cold did not bother him as much as it should, but for the companionship of the flame. He would eat a small piece of his dried meat, chewing it slowly, making it last. He would drink a small amount of water, just enough to wet his throat. Then he would sleep. His sleep was not restful. It was filled with dreams of the past, of faces and places he could no longer touch. He dreamed of Gilead, the great city of his youth, its banners flying in the wind. He dreamed of his father, Stephen, a great gunslinger in his own right. He dreamed of his friends, Cuthbert and Alain. He dreamed of a girl named Susan. These dreams were ghosts that haunted his sleep, and when he woke, the emptiness of the desert felt even more profound. One day, as he walked, he saw something out of place in the endless white. It was a small, desiccated plant, a devil grass. It was brown and dead, but its roots still clung to the cracked earth. Roland stopped and looked at it for a long time. He reached out a gloved hand and touched one of its brittle leaves. It crumbled to dust at his touch. He thought about the plant's struggle. It had tried to live here, in this impossible place. It had failed. But it had tried. For some reason, this thought gave him a small measure of comfort. He was not so different from the devil grass. He was also trying to survive in a world that did not want him. He straightened up and continued his walk. The man in black was still ahead of him, a dark speck in the distance of his mind. Days turned into a week. The water was gone. His throat was a dry, raw thing. His lips were cracked and bleeding. The sun was a physical weight on his shoulders. He began to see things that were not there. He saw a great, dark bird circling high above him. He saw a city of glass shimmering in the heat haze. He saw the face of the man in black, laughing at him from behind a rock. He knew they were illusions, tricks of the heat and his thirsty mind, but they were persistent. He kept walking. His body was a machine, and the machine's only function was to move forward. One foot in front of the other. Over and over. The world had shrunk to this simple, brutal rhythm. He remembered his last companion, a mule named Balthazar. The mule had been a stubborn, stupid creature, but it had been a living thing in a dead world. It had carried his water and his supplies. It had been something to talk to, even if it never answered. The mule had died 3 days ago. It had simply laid down in the sand and refused to get up. Roland had stood over it for a long time, his hand on the hilt of one of his guns. A part of him, a cold and practical part, had told him to kill it and take what little meat was on its bones. But he could not do it. He had left the mule there, a feast for the crows and the desert insects that would surely come. He had taken what he could carry and walked on alone. The memory of the mule was a dull ache in his chest. It was another loss, another piece of his world gone forever. It was in this state, near the edge of death, that he found the way station. It was not a mirage, it was real. A small wooden building sitting in the middle of nowhere with a stable next to it. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for 1,000 years. Hope was a dangerous thing, but he allowed himself a small measure of it. He staggered toward the building, his legs weak and clumsy. The wood was grey and splintered, the windows were boarded up. But there was a pump outside, a real water pump. He put all of his remaining strength into working the handle, up and down, up and down. The pump groaned and protested, the sound of dry metal on dry metal. For a long moment nothing happened. He thought it was broken, a final cruel joke from the desert. But then a trickle of water came out. It was brown and rusty at first, but then it ran clear. He drank until his stomach ached, until the water ran down his chin and soaked the front of his shirt. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He splashed the cool water on his face, washing away the dust and grime of the desert. He felt life returning to him, a slow, warm tide. After he had his fill, he refilled his water skins. Then he turned his attention to the way station itself. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The main room was a common area with a few broken tables and chairs. There was a bar in the corner, covered in a thick layer of grime. It was a place of ghosts. He could almost hear the echoes of past conversations, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. But it had been a long time since anyone had laughed in this place. He explored the building carefully. He found a cellar, and in the cellar he found something that was not a ghost. It was a demon. It did not have horns or a tail. It was a presence in the darkness, a voice that slithered into his mind. It spoke of old things, of the time before the world had moved on. It offered him a trade, information for a favor. The demon was bound to this place, and it was lonely. It wanted to speak. Roland was a gunslinger. He did not trust demons, but he needed information. The man in black had passed this way. The demon knew things. Roland listened to the demon's whispers. It told him stories of the old ones, of the great machines that powered the world, and of the war that had broken them. It spoke of the tower, the center of all things, and of the man in black's desire to see it fall. The demon's price was a jawbone, the jawbone of the long-dead mule that lay out in the desert. It was a strange request, but Roland agreed. He had no love for the mule's bones. He left the way station and walked back out into the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The walk back to the mule was easier now that he had water and a purpose. He found the animal where he had left it. The desert had already begun its work. The crows had been there. He took out his knife and did what the demon had asked. He did not enjoy the task, but it was necessary. He returned to the way station with the jawbone. He threw it down into the dark cellar. The demon was pleased. It gave him the information he sought. The man in black was heading toward the mountains, but he had made a stop. A small town called Tull. The demon laughed, a dry, rustling sound. It told Roland that the man in black had left a trap for him in Tull. A welcome party. Roland thanked the demon and left the cellar. He did not like the feeling of the demon's voice in his head. He spent the night in the way station, cleaning his guns. His revolvers were his life. They were extensions of his will, tools of his trade. They were made of a special steel passed down through his family for generations. The handles were made of sandalwood, smooth and worn from his grip. He cleaned them with a practiced, loving care. He reloaded them with fresh cartridges. Each bullet was a promise. Each bullet was a step closer to the tower. As he worked, he thought about Tull, a trap. The man in black was a sorcerer, a man of tricks and illusions. His traps were never simple. Roland knew he was walking into danger, but there was no other path. The path to the tower led through Tull. The next morning, he set out. The desert began to change. The white alkali flats gave way to sparse, yellow grass and small, twisted trees. He was leaving the true desert behind. He was getting closer to the world of men. He did not know if this was a good thing. The world of men had its own kind of dangers, often worse than the deserts. After 2 days of walking, he saw it. A small collection of buildings huddled together on a dusty plain. Tull? It did not look like much. A few dozen wooden houses, a church, a saloon. It looked like a town on its last legs, a place that time had forgotten. But Roland knew better. The man in black had been here. That meant this place was poisoned. He walked into the town slowly, his eyes scanning everything. The streets were empty. The windows of the houses were like vacant eyes. A single, thin dog watched him pass, its tail tucked between its legs. There was a feeling of wrongness here, a heavy silence that was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath. He made his way to the saloon. It was the only place that showed any sign of life. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Shebs." He pushed open the swinging doors and stepped inside. The saloon was dark and smelled of stale beer and sawdust. A few men sat at tables, nursing drinks. They all stopped what they were doing and looked at him. Their faces were blank, their eyes guarded. A man was playing a piano in the corner, a sad, repetitive tune. He did not stop playing. Roland walked to the bar. A woman was behind it, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. Her name was Ali. She was pretty, but in a tired, worn-out way. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked at Roland with a flicker of something he could not name. Fear? Curiosity? She asked him what he wanted. He asked for beer and food. She drew him a beer from a wooden tap and placed it on the bar. She told him the food would be a few minutes. Roland drank the beer. It was warm and bitter, but it was wet. He watched the other patrons in the mirror behind the bar. They were pretending not to look at him, but he could feel their eyes on his back. They were all wearing the same expression, a kind of dull, waiting expression. They were waiting for something to happen. Ali brought him a plate of beans and dried meat. He ate slowly, deliberately. He asked her about the man in black. He described him. A tall man dressed in dark clothes, a sorcerer. Ali's hand trembled as she wiped the bar. She told him that such a man had been through Tull. He had stayed for a while. He had performed a miracle. Roland asked, what kind of miracle? Ali looked around as if afraid of being overheard. She leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. She told him about a man named Naut. Naut was a farmer, a simple man who drank too much. One day, he had died. Fell down in the street, his heart stopped. The whole town saw it. The man in black had come. He had knelt over Naut's body and touched him. And Naut had gotten up. He had come back to life. Roland felt a cold knot in his stomach. Necromancy. Black magic of the worst kind. The man in black was even more powerful than he had imagined. Ali told him that the resurrected Naut was not the same. He was quiet, strange. His eyes were empty, but he was alive. The miracle had changed the town. It had brought them a new kind of faith, a dark faith. The town's preacher, a woman named Sylvia Pittston, had declared the man in black a prophet. She said he was a messenger from the gods. She had started a new church, a new religion based on this one dark act. Her sermons were full of fire and prophecy. She told the people of Tull that they were a chosen people and that an interloper would come, a demon in the shape of a man, to test their faith. The interloper would be a gunslinger. Roland finished his meal. He knew now the nature of the trap. The man in black had not set a physical trap of ropes and pits. He had set a spiritual one. He had turned an entire town into a weapon and aimed it at Roland. Ali looked at him with pity in her eyes. She told him he should leave. She told him that nothing good could happen for him here. He could see that she was a good person, a small island of sanity in a sea of madness. He felt a strange urge to protect her, to take her away from this place. But he could not. His path was a lonely one. He could not afford to carry anyone else. He told her he had to stay. He was waiting for someone. He paid for his meal and went to get a room. The piano player in the corner continued his sad, endless tune. Roland spent the afternoon in his room, watching the town from his window. He saw the people of Tull moving about their day. They all had the same look on their faces, a kind of vacant, zealous calm. He saw Sylvia Pittston, the preacher. She was a tall, thin woman in a black dress, her face sharp and severe. She walked through the town like a queen, and the people bowed their heads as she passed. He also saw Naut, the man who had died. He was working in a field, his movements slow and mechanical. He looked like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen master. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the town. The atmosphere grew heavier, more menacing. Roland knew the confrontation was coming. It would happen tonight. He checked his guns again. He laid them on the small bed in his room. They were his only friends in this town. He thought about his training. He remembered his teacher, Court, a hard, unforgiving man who had beaten the lessons of the gunslinger into him. Court had taught him that a gunslinger's mind must be a fortress, immune to fear and doubt. He had taught him to shoot with his heart, not his hand. He had taught him that his purpose was to protect the white, the force of good and order in the universe. But the white was gone now. Gilead had fallen. All that was left was the tower, and the ghosts. So many ghosts. As darkness fell, the sound of a church bell echoed through the town. It was time. Roland could hear the people gathering in the street below. He could hear Sylvia Pittston's voice rising in a passionate, hypnotic sermon. She was telling them about the demon who had come to their town. She was telling them that he was a test of their faith. She was telling them that they had to cast him out. Her voice was a whip, lashing them into a frenzy. Roland picked up his guns. The sandalwood grips felt cool and familiar in his hands. He spun the cylinders. They clicked into place with a sound that was both final and comforting. He walked to the door of his room. He could hear footsteps on the stairs. They were coming for him. He did not wait for them to break down the door. He opened it himself and stepped out into the hallway. There were 5 men there, their faces twisted with a righteous fury. They were holding farming tools, pitchforks and scythes. They were not warriors. They were simple men twisted into monsters by a sorcerer's lies. Roland did not feel anger toward them. He felt a deep, profound sadness. He raised his guns. The first shot was deafening in the narrow hallway. The man in front fell. The others hesitated for a moment, shocked by the sudden violence. That moment was all Roland needed. He moved with a speed that was not quite human. His guns spoke again and again, a terrible rhythmic chorus of death. It was over in seconds. 5 men lay on the floor. Roland stepped over their bodies and walked down the stairs. The saloon was filled with people. They were no longer the quiet, waiting men he had seen earlier. Their eyes were wild, their faces contorted with hate. Sylvia Pittston stood on a table, her arms raised to the sky, her voice screaming for his blood. When they saw him, they charged. The saloon erupted into chaos. Tables were overturned, glasses were shattered. The piano player was crushed in the initial rush. Roland stood his ground. He became a machine. A whirlwind of motion and sound. His mind was clear and cold. He did not aim with his hand. He who aims with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. He aimed with his eye. He did not shoot with his hand. He who shoots with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. He shot with his mind. He did not kill with his gun. He who kills with his gun has forgotten the face of his father. He killed with his heart. The words of the gunslinger's creed were a silent mantra in his head. He moved through the crowd like a reaper through a field of wheat. The faces of the townspeople blurred together, a single entity of hate. He saw men and women, young and old. It did not matter. They had all been poisoned. They were all part of the trap. He was not fighting people. He was fighting the will of the man in black. The smell of gun smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. The sound of the guns was a continuous roar. He was a force of nature, an act of cleansing. And it was a terrible, ugly thing. He felt a part of his own soul dying with every person who fell. He saw Allie. She was huddled behind the bar, her face pale with terror. A man was coming toward her, his eyes crazed, a broken bottle in his hand. Roland turned and fired without thinking. The man fell. Allie looked at Roland, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and horror. She was seeing him for what he was, not a man, but a killer, a monster born of necessity. Then she was gone, lost in the swirling chaos. The fight spilled out into the street. The entire town was against him now. They came at him from all sides, a wave of bodies and makeshift weapons. He kept moving, kept shooting. His ammunition was running low. He had to make every shot count. He moved with an economy of motion, a deadly grace that was both beautiful and horrifying to behold. He saw Sylvia Pittston in the middle of the street. She was holding a cross, screaming at him, calling him a demon. She believed her faith would protect her. She was wrong. Roland shot her. She fell to the ground, a look of surprise on her face. With her death, the frenzy seemed to break. The townspeople stopped, looking at their fallen preacher, then at the bodies that littered the street. The madness in their eyes began to fade, replaced by confusion and fear. They were no longer a mob. They were just people again, standing in the middle of a slaughterhouse that had once been their home. They looked at Roland, not with hate, but with a dawning, terrible understanding of what had happened. They had been used. Roland did not wait for their grief to turn back into anger. He walked through the now silent street. His guns were empty. His body ached. He was covered in blood and dust. He saw Naut, the resurrected man, standing alone by the church. Naut looked at him with his strange, empty eyes and then simply fell over, his strings finally cut. The man in black's magic was broken. Roland walked back into the saloon. He was looking for Allie. He found her. She was lying behind the bar. She had not been killed by the mob. In the chaos, she had been hit by one of his own bullets, a stray shot, an accident. He knelt beside her. She was still alive, but barely. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a sad understanding. She reached out and touched his face. Her hand was cold. She tried to say something, but only a trickle of blood came from her lips. Then she was gone. Roland stood up. He felt nothing. The part of him that could feel grief or remorse had been burned away a long time ago. All that was left was the quest, the cold, hard purpose that drove him forward. He looked around the silent, ruined town. This was the work of the man in black. This was the evil he was chasing. He went to the general store. He took food, water, and all the ammunition he could find. No one tried to stop him. The survivors of Tull simply watched him, their faces like masks of stone. They were ghosts in their own town. He loaded his supplies and walked out of Tull without looking back. He walked back into the wilderness, toward the mountains that loomed in the distance. The sun was rising. It was a new day. But for Roland, it was just the same day, over and over again. The pursuit continued. The man in black was still ahead of him. And the tower was still waiting. The ghosts of Tull now walked with him, a silent procession in his mind. They were another weight he had to carry on his long, lonely road. Part 2. The Way Station and the Boy. The town of Tull was a scar on the landscape behind him, and a fresh scar on his soul. Roland did not look back. To look back was to invite the ghosts to walk closer, and they were already close enough. He could feel them, the silent weight of all the lives he had taken. It was not guilt he felt, not in the way other men might feel it. It was a cold, hard accounting, a price paid. The man in black had turned those people into a weapon, and Roland had disarmed it in the only way he knew how. The cost was high, but the path to the tower demanded such sacrifices. He had known that for a long time. Still, the face of Allie, the barmaid, flickered in his memory. Her look of horror and her final, sad understanding. He had not meant to kill her. A stray bullet in the chaos, an accident. But accidents were just another name for fate in this world, and his fate was a grim one. He pushed the thought away. It was a weakness, it was a distraction. The quest was all that mattered. He walked for days, leaving the dusty plains of Tull far behind. The land began to change again, slowly, subtly. The last vestiges of the great desert gave way to a desolate, broken country. The ground was hard and rocky, littered with strange, rust-colored stones. Sparse, twisted trees, more like wooden skeletons than living things, clawed at the sky. The grass was yellow and dead, and it crunched under his boots like broken glass. This was a land that was truly dying. He passed ancient, crumbling roads, their surfaces shattered and split by weeds. He saw the skeletal remains of strange, long-dead animals, their bones bleached white by the sun. Occasionally, he would see the ruins of a building, a lone brick chimney standing like a tombstone, or the foundation of a house long since turned to dust. These were the signs that a great civilization had once existed here. A civilization of power and wonder. His civilization. It was all gone now. The world had moved on, and it had left these bones behind as a reminder of its own decay. The sun was still a hostile presence, but it was different now. It seemed more distant, its light weaker, as if it too were growing old and tired. The air was thin and carried a strange metallic taste. The silence was profound. It was not the clean, empty silence of the desert. It was a heavy, waiting silence, the silence of a tomb. There was no birdsong, no buzz of insects. The only sounds were the crunch of his own footsteps and the whisper of the wind as it moved through the dead grass. He was utterly alone. He walked with a steady, relentless pace. He refilled his water skins from a slow, muddy stream that tasted of rust. He ate his dried meat and the supplies he had taken from Tull. He was a machine built for walking, a vessel for a single, unyielding purpose. At night, he would build a small fire and stare into the flames. The flames were alive, a small spark of defiance in the dead land. In the dancing light, he would see faces from his past. His father, stern and proud, Cuthbert, with his endless jokes and his love for riddles, Alain, quiet and thoughtful, the most gentle of them all, and Susan, the girl he had loved, the girl he had lost. They were all ghosts, just like the people of Tull. His past was a graveyard, and he was its weary caretaker. He thought often of his training under Court. Court had been a brutal teacher, a man made of stone and iron. He had taught Roland and his friends with his fists and his voice. He had beaten them, pushed them, and broken them, all to forge them into gunslingers. He had taught them the high speech, the ancient language of their people. He had taught them how to fight with knives and with their hands. And most importantly, he had taught them the way of the gun. The gun was not just a weapon. It was an extension of the self. It was a symbol of their order, of their commitment to the white. He remembered the day of his test, his passage into manhood. He had faced Court with a hawk as his weapon. He had won, but the victory had cost him. It always did. Court had taught him that a gunslinger must be willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for the sake of the quest. Even those they loved. It was a hard lesson, a lesson that had been burned into his soul with pain and loss, and he was still living that lesson every single day. His supplies began to dwindle. The food was nearly gone. The water tasted worse with each passing day. He knew he could not last much longer in this wasteland. He needed to find shelter, a place to rest and resupply. It was then, when his hope was beginning to fade, that he found the second way station. It was almost identical to the first one he had found in the desert. A squat wooden building with a stable sitting in a shallow, rocky valley. It was another relic of a forgotten age, a stop on a road that no one travelled anymore. He approached it with caution. The world was full of traps, and he had learned not to trust signs of hope. But the place was empty. The doors creaked open under his hand. The inside was the same as the other, dust decay, and the ghosts of forgotten travelers. But there was a water pump outside, and like the other, it worked. He drank deeply, the rusty water a balm to his parched throat. He felt a profound sense of relief. He had been given another chance. He decided to rest there for a few days to gather his strength. He explored the stable and found old, rotten hay and the bones of a long-dead horse. He explored the main building, finding nothing of use but a few broken pieces of furniture. He found the cellar, a dark, square hole in the floor. He felt a strange presence coming from it, a familiar feeling. He called down into the darkness. A voice answered. It was not the same demon as before, but it was a similar creature, a being trapped between worlds, hungry for conversation. This one's voice was different, like the sound of dripping water in a deep cave. It too had seen the man in black. It too offered a trade. Information for a simple price. This demon did not want a jawbone, it wanted a story. It wanted to hear of the world outside its dark, dusty prison. Roland sat at the edge of the cellar opening, his legs dangling into the darkness. And he talked. He told the demon of his journey across the desert. He told it of Tull, of the massacre and the poisoned faith. He spoke of the gunslingers, of the fall of Gilead, and of his endless quest for the Dark Tower. He spoke for hours, his voice a low monotone, in the quiet way station. The demon listened, its unseen presence soaking up the words like a dry sponge. It was a strange confession, a telling of his life to a creature of darkness. But in the telling, he felt a small piece of his burden lift. When he was finished, the demon was satisfied. It upheld its end of the bargain. It told him that the man in black was far ahead, on his way to the mountains. It told him that the man in black was not his true enemy, but merely a servant of a greater darkness, the Crimson King. And it told him one more thing, a cryptic warning. It said that the man in black had left another trap for Roland, but this one was different. It was not a town full of fanatics, it was a single person. A boy. The demon said the boy was a key, a sacrifice that would be required to reach the man in black. Then the demon fell silent, its curiosity sated. Roland left the cellar, the demon's words echoing in his mind. A boy, a sacrifice. It was another of the sorcerer's cruel games. He felt a cold anger, but also a weary resignation. He knew he would have to face this trap, just as he had faced the one in Tull. He spent the rest of the day cleaning his guns and preparing for the next leg of his journey. He slept in the main room of the way station, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The next day, he was preparing to leave when he heard a sound. It was the sound of someone approaching the way station. He drew his gun and moved to the window, his body tense. He expected to see a monster, a mutant, or perhaps an agent of the man in black. What he saw was a boy. The boy was about 11 or 12 years old. He was wearing strange, brightly colored clothes that were completely out of place in this drab, dying world. A blue shirt with letters on it, blue trousers made of a strange, stiff fabric, and brightly colored shoes. He was walking with a dazed, stumbling gait, as if he were lost in a dream. He looked thin and scared. He saw the way station, and his face lit up with a desperate hope. He ran the last few feet and began to work the handle of the water pump, just as Roland had done. Roland watched him for a long moment, his gun still in his hand. The demon's words came back to him. The boy, the trap, this had to be him. But he did not look like a trap. He looked like a lost child. Roland lowered his gun. He could not shoot a child, no matter what the demon said. He stepped out of the way station. The boy heard him and spun around, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at Roland, at his dusty clothes, his weathered face, and the big iron guns on his hips. He looked terrified. Roland held up his empty hands to show he meant no harm. He asked the boy his name. The boy hesitated, then said his name was Jake. Roland asked him where he came from. Jake's answer made no sense. He said he was from New York. He spoke of a world with tall buildings made of glass and steel, of cars that moved without horses, and of great metal birds that flew in the sky. It sounded like a fairy tale, a story from the time before the world had moved on. Roland had heard such stories, whispers of other worlds, other realities that existed alongside his own. He had always thought they were just legends. But looking at this boy, at his strange clothes and his strange words, he began to believe. Jake told him his story. He said he had been on his way to school. He remembered a man in dark clothes, a man who had smiled at him. Then he remembered being pushed. He remembered the sound of a car's horn and the screech of tires, and then nothing. The next thing he knew, he had woken up here at this way station with no memory of how he had arrived. The man in dark clothes, it had to be the man in black. He had somehow taken this boy from his own world and placed him here, a piece on the game board. Roland felt a surge of cold fury at the sorcerer's cruelty. To use a child in this way was an evil beyond measure. Roland knew he had a choice. He could leave the boy here. He could abandon him to this dying world and continue his quest alone. It would be the smart thing to do, the practical thing. A gunslinger on a quest could not afford attachments. But he looked at Jake's scared, lost face, and he saw all the children of Gilead who had been lost in the final war. He saw a flicker of the boy he himself had once been, before the world had hardened him into what he was now. He could not leave him. It was a foolish, sentimental decision, a decision that went against all of his training and his instincts. But he made it anyway. He told Jake he could travel with him, he would protect him, he would help him find his way. Jake's eyes filled with tears of relief. For the first time in a long time, the boy did not look scared. He looked like he had found something to hold on to. And for the first time in a long time, Roland did not feel completely alone. Their journey together began slowly. Jake was weak and knew nothing of survival. Roland had to teach him everything. He taught him how to build a fire with flint and steel. He taught him how to find clean water and how to identify the few edible plants that grew in the rocky soil. He taught him how to walk without wasting energy, how to read the signs of the land, and how to be silent. Jake was a quick learner. He was smart and resilient. The city boy learned the ways of the wilderness with a surprising speed. He rarely complained. He just watched Roland with a quiet intensity, soaking up the knowledge. The roles of teacher and student created a bond between them. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire. The silence between them was no longer the empty silence of loneliness, but a comfortable silence of companionship. Jake would ask questions. He was endlessly curious about Roland's world. He asked about the gunslingers, about Gilead, and about the Dark Tower. Roland, who had not spoken of his past to anyone for years, found himself answering. He told Jake stories of his youth, of his training, of the glory of Gilead before the fall. He spoke of the car, the concept of destiny that guided all things. He told him of the great beams that held up the sky and of the tower that stood at the center of them all. He found that telling the stories made the past feel more real, less like a dream. It also made the pain of his loss more acute. One evening, Jake asked about the guns. He asked why Roland carried them, why he was so good with them. Roland looked at the boy, at his young, innocent face. He decided it was time to teach him the most important lesson of all. He had Jake recite the words of the Gunslinger's creed after him. "I do not aim with my hand, He who aims with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. I aim with my eye." Jake repeated the words, his voice small in the vast emptiness of the night. "I do not shoot with my hand. He who shoots with his hand has forgotten the face of his father. I shoot with my mind." Roland's voice was a low, solemn chant. "I do not kill with my gun. He who kills with his gun has forgotten the face of his father. I kill with my heart." When they were finished, a deep silence fell between them. Jake did not fully understand the words, but he felt their weight. He understood that being a gunslinger was more than just being good with a gun. It was a way of life, a code of honor, a sacred duty. As they traveled, Roland felt a change in himself. The presence of the boy was like a small, warm light in the cold darkness of his soul. Jake's simple questions, his youthful optimism, his unquestioning trust in Roland, all of it began to wear away at the hard shell he had built around his heart. He found himself smiling at the boy's jokes. He found himself feeling a pang of worry when Jake stumbled or fell. He started to see the boy not as a burden or as a trap, but as a companion, a friend. He even began to feel something akin to love for him, the protective love of a father for a son. And this terrified him more than any monster or demon. Love was a weakness. Love could be used against him. He remembered Susan and the pain that her loss had brought him. He remembered Court's lessons about sacrifice. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the man in black had put Jake in his path for a reason. He knew that a moment was coming when he would have to choose between the boy and the tower. Their journey took them out of the rocky wasteland and into a dying forest. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches bare and black against the grey sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of brown, rotting leaves. A sluggish black river wound its way through the forest, its water polluted and foul. They passed more signs of the old world here. The rusted hulk of a car, its strange shape half buried in the mud. A crumbling concrete pylon from a bridge that had collapsed centuries ago. They even found a place where the ground was made of a hard, black substance, a stretch of an ancient road. Jake recognized it. He called it an asphalt highway. He told Roland about the thousands of cars that would have driven on such a road in his world. Roland listened, trying to imagine such a thing. A world so full of life and motion. It seemed like an impossible dream. One day they were running low on food. They had not seen any game for weeks. They were eating the last of their dried meat. Roland decided to teach Jake how to hunt. He gave Jake one of his guns. The revolver was heavy in the boy's small hands. Roland showed him how to hold it, how to aim, how to control his breathing. He told him that to take a life, even an animal's, was a serious thing. It should only be done for food, for survival. They found the tracks of a rabbit and followed them. They found the rabbit hiding in a small bush. Roland told Jake to take the shot. Jake aimed. His hands were shaking. He looked at the small, trembling animal. He couldn't do it. He lowered the gun, his face pale. He told Roland he couldn't kill it. Roland was not angry. He was proud. The boy still had a softness in his heart, a compassion that Roland himself had lost long ago. Roland took the gun and killed the rabbit with a single, clean shot. They cooked it over the fire that night. It was the first fresh meat they had had in a long time. Their bond deepened with each passing day. They developed a routine. They would walk all day, speaking little, saving their energy. In the evening, they would make camp and talk. They were no longer just a gunslinger and a lost boy. They were a team, a family, a quartet of two, as Roland's people would have said, a group drawn together by destiny. But the shadow of the man in black was always there. Roland could feel him ahead, waiting. He could feel the trap closing around them. He started having nightmares. He dreamed of the mountains, of a dark tunnel, and of a terrible choice. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the name of the boy on his lips. He knew what was coming. The demon's prophecy was coming true. The boy was a sacrifice. And Roland knew with a terrible, soul-crushing certainty that when the time came, he would choose the tower. He had to. It was his curse. It was his destiny. And it was a destiny that was going to break his heart all over again. He looked at the sleeping boy, his face peaceful in the firelight, and felt a wave of despair wash over him. He was leading this child to his doom, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The path to the tower was paved with the bones of those he loved, and Jake, the boy from another world, was going to be the next paving stone on that long, dark road. Part 3. The Mountain and the Palaver. The dying forest was behind them, a place of rot and shadow. Ahead, the land rose up to meet the sky. The mountains were no longer a distant promise or a hazy silhouette. They were a reality, a great wall of jagged grey rock that clawed at the clouds. They looked ancient and angry, a place where the bones of the earth were exposed to the heavens. The air grew thinner, colder. The constant oppressive heat of the lowlands was replaced by a sharp, clean chill that bit at their exposed skin. Roland felt the change not just in the air, but in his soul. This was the final stage. He could feel the presence of the man in black, a cold spot in the world, waiting for him in the heart of that stone. And he could feel the threads of destiny, pulling tight around him and the boy who walked beside him. Jake had grown stronger. The city softness was gone from his face, replaced by a lean toughness. His eyes, once wide with fear and confusion, were now sharp and observant. He moved with a quiet confidence, his footsteps sure on the rocky ground. He had learned the lessons of this hard world well. He was no longer just a passenger on Roland's journey. He was a partner. He helped gather firewood, kept watch while Roland slept, and carried his own small share of their supplies. He had become a true companion, and the bond between them was now as solid and real as the mountains themselves. They were a strange pair, the last gunslinger from a dead world and the lost boy from a world of impossible wonders. A father and a son forged not by blood, but by shared hardship in a dying land. They walked for days into the foothills, the towering peaks looming ever closer. The silence between them was often deep, but it was a comfortable silence. They had learned to communicate without words, with a shared glance, a nod, a simple gesture. But at night, by the warmth of their small, sputtering fires, they would talk. Jake would speak of his world, of New York. He described the endless river of cars, the buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the stars, the food that came in bright packages, and the magical boxes that showed moving pictures and told stories. To Roland, it sounded like a realm of pure magic, a place of such casual wonders that it was hard to comprehend. He listened with a quiet fascination, the stories a brief escape from the grim reality of his own world. In turn, Roland would tell Jake more stories of Gilead. He spoke of the great feasts in the halls of his father's castle, of the dances and the songs. He told him of the code of the gunslingers, the ideals of honor, duty, and justice that they had been sworn to uphold. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a profound and aching sadness. He was describing a ghost, a beautiful dream that had crumbled into a nightmare of dust and blood. Jake would listen, his young face serious in the firelight. He was beginning to understand the immense weight of the past that Roland carried on his shoulders. He was beginning to understand that the gunslinger was not just a man on a quest. but the last remnant of a fallen kingdom, a walking memory of a world that was gone forever. As they climbed higher, the landscape became more treacherous. They navigated narrow, winding paths that clung to the sides of steep cliffs. The wind howled around them, a mournful, lonely sound. Below them, the world stretched out in a vast, desolate panorama of brown and grey. Roland's instincts were screaming. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. The trap was closing. He could feel it in the air, in the rocks, in the cold, unblinking stare of the sky. The love he felt for the boy was a constant, painful ache in his chest. It was a warmth he had not allowed himself to feel for a very long time, and he knew it was a warmth that was about to be extinguished. He found himself watching Jake with a desperate intensity, trying to memorize the way he walked, the sound of his voice, the look of concentration on his face as he navigated a difficult patch of trail. He was saying goodbye in 1,000 small, silent ways, and the boy never even knew it. One evening, as they made camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang, Jake found a small blue flower growing in a crack in the stone. It was a tiny, fragile thing, a single spot of color in the vast grayness. He picked it and gave it to Roland. He said it was for good luck. Roland took the flower. Its petals were soft and delicate in his rough, calloused hand. He looked at the boy, at his hopeful, trusting face, and for a moment, the gunslinger's iron control almost broke. He wanted to tell Jake to run, to go back, to find a place to hide, and to forget he had ever met him. He wanted to save him from the fate that was rushing toward them. But he could not. The tower, the quest, was a fever in his blood, an obsession that had consumed his life. He could no more turn from his path than the planet could turn from its orbit around the sun. He simply nodded, tucked the small flower into a pocket of his worn leather vest and said thank you. The words felt like a betrayal. They finally found the entrance. It was not a natural cave. It was an old tunnel, a dark, gaping mouth in the side of the mountain. Faded letters were carved into the stone lintel above it, in a language that Jake did not know but Roland recognized as a debased form of the high speech. It was an old service entrance for the mines that had once riddled this mountain, a part of the vast, unseen machinery of the old world. A single, rusted railway track led from the entrance into the suffocating darkness. This was the way forward. There was no other. Jake looked into the blackness with a nervous apprehension. Roland put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He told him they had to go through. He told him to stay close and not to be afraid. Roland himself was not afraid of the dark. He was afraid of what waited for them in that dark. He was afraid of the choice he knew he would have to make. They stepped into the tunnel, and the world outside disappeared. The light was swallowed by a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet stone, mildew, and something else. Something old and unpleasant, like spoiled meat. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water echoing from unseen places, a sound like a slow, patient clock ticking down to a final, terrible moment. Roland lit a small torch he had prepared, a piece of wood wrapped in cloth and soaked in oil. The flame flickered to life, casting a small, wavering circle of orange light. It was a fragile defense against the immense pressing darkness. The light revealed walls of wet, glistening rock and the single rusted track stretching ahead of them into the gloom. They began to walk, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The tunnel was a place of deep and ancient misery. Roland could feel it in the stone, a residue of all the suffering that had taken place here in the forgotten past. This had been a place of slaves and machines, a place of endless, joyless labor. The ghosts of that time were still here, their silent screams trapped in the eternal night of the mountain's heart. Jake walked close behind Roland, his hand often brushing against the gunslinger's back for reassurance. He was scared, but he was also brave. He did not cry out or complain. He just kept walking, trusting the man who led him through the darkness. For Roland, every step was a step closer to the inevitable. He felt like a man walking to his own execution, except he was not the one who was going to die. After what felt like hours of walking, they began to hear a new sound. It was a wet, shuffling noise, accompanied by low, guttural moans. It was the sound of something moving in the darkness ahead. Roland stopped. He held the torch high, peering into the gloom. The shuffling grew louder. He could see shapes moving at the edge of the light, things that were vaguely human in form, but twisted and wrong. They were the slow mutants. Roland had heard tales of them, the descendants of the old miners and workers who had been trapped underground when the world moved on. Generations of darkness, radiation, and inbreeding had turned them into these pathetic, monstrous creatures. Their skin was pale and slick, their eyes were large, milky orbs that had long ago lost the ability to see. Their limbs were twisted and malformed. They were not evil. They were just what was left. Tragic remnants of a forgotten people. The mutants shambled toward them, drawn by the light and the scent of living flesh. They were not attacking so much as they were simply moving toward the strange new thing in their world. Their moans were not threats, but sounds of confusion and hunger. There were dozens of them, a slow, shuffling tide of misery. Roland pushed Jake behind him. He drew one of his revolvers. He did not want to kill these creatures. It felt like shooting cripples, but they were blocking the path, and they were a danger to the boy. He aimed carefully and fired. The sound of the gunshot was a physical blow in the enclosed tunnel, a deafening explosion that echoed on and on. One of the mutants fell. The others paused, confused by the loud noise. Then they started coming again, their moans turning into low, angry growls. Roland fired again and again. He did not waste bullets. Each shot was a precise, economical act of destruction. He was not fighting a battle. He was clearing a path. He moved with a cold, detached efficiency. Jake watched from behind him, his face a mask of horror. He had never seen the gunslinger in action like this, a calm, relentless force of death. It was terrifying, and yet he knew Roland was doing it to protect him. The mutants were slow and clumsy. They were no match for a gunslinger. One by one, they fell. The tunnel floor became littered with their pale, twisted bodies. Finally, the path was clear. The remaining mutants, frightened by the noise and the death of their kin, shuffled back into the side tunnels and the deeper darkness from which they had come. The moaning faded, replaced once again by the steady, patient drip of water. Roland did not look at the bodies. He simply reloaded his gun and motioned for Jake to follow. They walked on, the smell of blood and gun smoke now added to the foul air of the tunnel. Jake was silent. The experience had shaken him deeply. He had seen the raw, brutal reality of this world, a world where life was cheap and survival was a bloody business. He looked at Roland's back, at the steady, unwavering stride of the gunslinger, and he felt a new kind of awe for the man. He was a monster, yes, but he was his monster. He was the one who stood between Jake and the all-consuming darkness. They walked for what felt like another lifetime. The tunnel began to slope downward. The air grew warmer, and they could hear a new sound, a low, distant rumble, like faraway thunder. They emerged from the tunnel, not into the open air, but into a vast, cavernous space deep beneath the mountain. The cavern was so huge that their torchlight could not reach the ceiling or the far walls. The rumbling sound was louder here, the sound of a great underground river or a waterfall somewhere in the darkness, and spanning the chasm before them was a bridge. It was an ancient railway trestle, a spiderweb of rusted iron and rotting wood that stretched across a black abyss of unknown depth. The single track continued across the bridge. Sitting on the track, near their end of the bridge, was a small, ancient handcart, a simple wooden platform with 4 iron wheels and a hand crank for propulsion. On the other side of the chasm, a single point of light flickered, a campfire, and next to the fire, a figure, a man in black, waiting patiently. The trap was sprung, the final act was about to begin. Roland looked at the bridge, at the man on the other side, and then at Jake. The boy's face was pale in the torchlight. He understood. This was it. This was the man they had been following. This was the sorcerer who had brought him to this world. The man in black raised a hand in a casual, mocking wave. He did not shout across the chasm. He did not have to. His voice simply appeared in Roland's mind, a calm, amused whisper. "You have come far, Gunslinger, and you brought the boy. Excellent. The price of passage is at hand." Roland's hand rested on the butt of his gun. He could try to shoot the sorcerer from here, but the distance was too great, the light too poor. It would be a wasted shot. The only way across was the bridge. He looked at the handcart. It was their only way. He knew it was a terrible risk. The bridge looked like it could collapse at any moment, but there was no turning back. He and Jake pushed the handcart onto the tracks of the bridge. It moved with a loud, grinding screech of rusted wheels on rusted rails. They climbed onto the small platform. Roland took the crank. He began to turn it. The handcart lurched forward, moving out over the black, bottomless chasm. The journey across the bridge was a nightmare. The structure groaned and swayed with every turn of the crank. Pieces of rotten wood fell from beneath them, disappearing into the darkness below. The wind howled through the cavern, pushing against them, trying to throw them from the tracks. Roland focused all his energy on the crank, his muscles straining. Jake held onto the platform, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the distant fire on the other side. They were halfway across when the man in black made his move. He simply raised a hand, and the bridge began to shake violently. The ancient iron screamed in protest. The wooden planks beneath them began to splinter and break. The track in front of them buckled and twisted. The handcart derailed, tipping sideways, held only by a single wheel caught on the twisted track. Jake lost his grip and slid off the platform. He cried out as he fell, but Roland was faster. He lunged and caught the boy's arm. His own body braced against the cart. And there they were, dangling over the abyss. Roland, holding the boy's life in one hand. Jake, his face a mask of pure terror, his eyes pleading with the gunslinger. The man in black stood on the other side, watching, his face unreadable in the firelight. He did not have to say a word. The choice was clear. The gunslinger could pull the boy up. They could try to climb the rest of the way, but the bridge was collapsing. They would likely both fall. Or he could let go. He could save himself. He could reach the other side. He could continue the quest. In that single, eternal moment, Roland's entire life flashed before his eyes. He saw his father's face, stern and demanding. He heard Court's voice, speaking of sacrifice. He saw the faces of his fallen friends, Cuthbert and Alain. He saw Susan, her eyes full of love and sorrow. He saw the white fields of Gilead, and he saw the red fields of its fall. He saw the tower, a dark, beautiful spire at the center of everything. And he saw the boy, Jake, the boy who had trusted him, who had followed him, who had brought a spark of warmth back into his frozen heart. He felt the boy's thin arm in his grasp. He could feel the pulse of his life. He could save him. But the tower was everything. It was the nexus of all worlds, the only thing that gave his broken life any meaning. To abandon the quest now for the sake of one boy would be to betray everyone he had ever lost. It would be to render all their deaths meaningless. He looked into Jake's eyes. The boy was no longer terrified. In that final moment, a strange, sad understanding dawned on his face. He knew what the gunslinger was going to do. He knew what he had to do. The boy's voice was not a scream, but a quiet, calm statement that cut through the roaring wind and the groaning of the dying bridge. "Go then," Jake said. "There are other worlds than these." And with that, he seemed to relax his grip. Roland felt the weight shift. He did not know if the boy let go or if his own hand, the hand of the gunslinger, the hand of destiny, simply opened. It did not matter. The boy was gone. He fell into the blackness, silent and swift, and disappeared. Roland felt something inside him break. It was a soundless, internal shattering, far louder than the collapse of the bridge. A part of his soul went into the abyss with the boy. He hung there for a moment, the empty space where Jake had been a cold void against his hand. Then, with a surge of pure, animalistic will, he pulled himself up. He climbed over the wreckage of the handcart, making his way along the groaning, collapsing remnants of the trestle. He did not look down, he did not think, he just moved. He was a machine again, a thing of pure purpose. He reached the other side of the chasm, just as the last section of the bridge tore away and plunged into the darkness. He stood on solid ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was alone. He had made his choice. He had paid the price. He walked toward the campfire. The man in black, the sorcerer named Walter, was sitting there, warming his hands by the flames. He looked up at Roland and smiled a thin, knowing smile. There was no triumph in it, only a kind of philosophical amusement. "You see?" Walter's voice was soft, reasonable. "It was necessary. He was the sacrifice. The tower requires such things." Roland stood before him, his face a mask of stone, his heart a hollow, aching drum. He raised his gun. Walter just shook his head slowly. "No, Gunslinger, not like that. Our time for fighting is long past. Now is the time for a palaver, a talk. Sit. There is much you do not understand." Roland did not sit. He remained standing, the gun aimed at the sorcerer's heart, but he did not shoot. The exhaustion of his journey, the shock of Jake's death, it all washed over him, leaving him empty and strangely calm. Walter began to talk. He spoke of the nature of the universe, of the countless worlds that hung like grapes on a vine. He spoke of the Dark Tower as the axle upon which all of these worlds spun. He said that the tower was sick, that the beams that supported it were failing, and that reality itself was beginning to fray at the edges. He spoke of the Crimson King, a mad, godlike entity from the primordial chaos, who sought to tear the tower down and rule over the ensuing darkness. Walter claimed that he, too, served the tower in his own way. He said that his purpose was to guide Roland, to forge him into the weapon that would be needed to reach the tower and set things right. As he spoke, he pulled a strange, ancient-looking deck of cards from his robe. Tarot cards. He laid them out on the ground between them. The first card showed a man hanging upside down from a tree. "This is you, Roland," Walter said. "The hanged man. Suspended between your past and your future, unable to move forward without sacrifice." Then he drew 3 more cards and laid them out in a line. "These are your destiny, the next steps on your path." The first card was the prisoner. It showed a man sitting in a dark cell, his body wasted but his eyes burning with a fierce intelligence. The second was the Lady of Shadows. It depicted a woman with two faces, one beautiful and one monstrous, standing before two doors. The third was the Pusher. It showed a man falling from a great height, pushed by an unseen hand. "You will draw these three from the world of the boy," Walter said. "They are your new quartet, your new gunslingers. They will help you reach the tower." Walter's voice was a hypnotic drone. He spoke for hours. He reached into a pouch and brought out a handful of dust. He threw it into the fire, and the flames leapt up, changing color. In the fire, Roland saw visions. He saw the universe, a vast, swirling sea of stars and galaxies. He saw the six beams, great lines of energy that crisscrossed reality, holding everything together. And at the center of it all, he saw the tower. It was more beautiful and more terrible than he had ever imagined, a dark spire of grey stone that rose to an impossible height, its top lost in a swirling vortex of clouds and stars. He felt a longing so intense it was a physical pain, a homesickness for a place he had never been. Walter told him that time was an illusion, that death was not an end, and that his quest was far greater than the simple pursuit of one man. He was a pawn in a cosmic game, a game played by forces so vast and powerful that they were beyond his comprehension. But he was an important pawn, perhaps the most important. As the sun began to rise, filtering down through unseen cracks in the roof of the great cavern, Walter's palaver came to an end. He looked at Roland, his eyes ancient and full of a strange, cold pity. "You are tired, Gunslinger," he said. "Your part of this chase is done. Now you must sleep. Sleep and be reborn on the shores of a new sea." He made a small, casual gesture with his hand. An overwhelming wave of exhaustion washed over Roland. His knees buckled. His gun fell from his numb fingers. He collapsed to the ground, and the world dissolved into darkness. He dreamed. He dreamed of Jake falling forever into the abyss. He dreamed of the tower, calling his name across the worlds. He dreamed of the three cards, the prisoner, the lady, and the pusher. He slept, a deep, dreamless sleep that was almost like death. When he finally awoke, everything was different. The fire was long dead, a circle of cold ash. The cavern was gone. He was sitting on a beach, his back against a smooth grey rock. Before him stretched a vast grey ocean, the waves rolling in with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. He felt old. His bones ached. His beard was long and matted. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of an older man. He looked beside him. A skeleton was sitting there, picked clean by the seabirds, dressed in the tattered remains of a black robe. Walter. He had been dead for a very, very long time. Roland looked at the skeleton, then out at the endless western sea. 10 years. He had slept for 10 years. The man in black was gone. That chase was over. But the cards were in his pocket. And somewhere, across that lonely sea, the dark tower was still waiting for him. The quest had only just begun.